Sister Lucille Theroux. I'm a sister of St. Joseph and have been a sister of St. Joseph nigh on these 63 years. As sisters of St. Joseph, we are very aware of what the letter to the Hebrews calls the crowd of witnesses. That is, those sisters who have gone before us, on whose shoulders we stand. And where we have a very physical reminder of this cloud of witnesses are the burial plots. Today we're just going to consider the two for the Troy area, two of the Troy area burial plots. One is here in Troy at St. Joseph's in South Troy. The Sisters of St. Joseph were invited by the Jesuits of St. Joseph's to come to Troy. And in the correspondence that the community received as they were talking about what was there here in Troy for the sisters, they said, of course, there was a church, there was a building that could be a school, there was a building that could be a residence for the sisters, and they said there was a cemetery. We began to have sisters buried in that cemetery in 1866. If you go to St. Joseph's and you find that plot, you will see that there are both sisters and novices, newer members in training, who are buried there. The reason is that gradually St. Joseph's was not only a residence for the sisters who worked in that parish, but it became the central house for sisters who ministered in this part of the state. One of the sisters buried there was the first sister who died in our area, what we would call now like the Albany area. She was Sister Philomena Ba. As a very young sister, she came to America from France. She took her vows in France. She came to St. Louis. She was very young at that time, probably her early 20s. For a while, she was the novice director there. And then she contracted tuberculosis. So she was sent to our area for the cure. You might have heard that in there were places outside Troy, Glenmore, out Pauling, that were sanitariums when the TB was very prevalent in the Troy area. So she's among the many sisters who were buried there. We have about 469, 470 sisters' graves there at St. Joseph's in a very large circular plot that also has a monument to sisters buried in other parts of the state. We still do have sisters buried sometimes near where they have ministered, especially if they've been there a long time. We're here in South Troy, and that was the center of the province for quite a while, until the early 1900s, when the needs of the community and the size of the residence didn't quite fit. So the community looked for another possibility, another place where they could have a training center for new members, a residence for retired people, and a central house from which sisters would go out to the various schools we now staffed in Troy. That building was called St. Josephs Seminary. It had actually been a priest seminary before we took it over. And it's now, you can still see it now, is because it's part of the library system at RPI. In 1933, in addition to the very oldest part of the building, there was a chapel, and that chapel is also now part of the seminary. We were there from 1908 till about 1958, when, again, the needs of the sisters and the expanding needs of RPI sort of coincided. And in 1958, the president of RPI and Sister Helen Patricia, who was the superior for the sisters of our area, signed a contract for sale. That sale was completed for $1.5 million. At that time, in 1958, that was the largest real estate transaction that had happened in Troy. We, as the sisters moved out of Troy, the Provincial House, in what we now know as St. Joseph's Provincial House in Latham, was being built. So in 1963, that building was formally dedicated. It was to be, again, a residence for sisters, a place where sisters would go to be retired, a place where new members would be educated. On the grounds of the Provincial House, a plot was dedicated to be the cemetery. That happened in the summer of 1965, and the first burial took place there in October of 1965. The first sister buried was a sister who was very well known for her work in our area with those who were sighted here. Over the years, we have continued to have burials there, and until up to and including Tuesday of this week, there are 729 graves in that cemetery. The physical cemetery and cemetery plots are one of the ways the memory of this cloud of witnesses is part of our lives. But it is a part of our life in many ways. Every morning when communities gather for prayer, one of our customs is that we would pray aloud the names of those sisters whose anniversary of death was that day. Obviously, sometimes the names would be people we've known very well. But it's very touching that we also call forth the names and the memories of sisters who died in the 1800s and the early 1900s. Our cemeteries are places of reverence and prayer. For us, it is a place where we are recalling our history and all of the service that has happened and that will go before us. So we see, for example, especially if you went to St. Joseph's in South Troy, you could look at those graves and you would see that there are sisters buried there who probably ministered and served during the flu epidemic of the early 1900s. Many of our religious superiors are buried in these cemeteries. And I remember when we were in discernment for leadership, I would often go and think about praying with and for those sisters who before us had served in leadership, asking them to help us rely on the guidance of the Spirit. Sometimes we'll meet people in the cemetery who are relatives or friends of the sisters there. And then sometimes there are just wonderful reminders. One of our sisters was out walking and a woman was praying in the cemetery. She came over and she said, you know, every year, I try to come at least once and pray at the grave of Sister Joan Skirmahorn. She taught me in school, but she really affected my life. Another of our sisters, Sister Mary Agnes Keogh, was very involved in pastoral care in the diocese. And there are a group of women who, with Mary Agnes, were early members of the pastoral care group for the diocese. Some of those women come kind of regularly too, to honor her presence there. Our grave sites are special to us and to these families, and then there are other ways that people honor them. A few years ago, a group of women from St. Michael's Parish took on as a project cleaning the graves of all of the sisters in the plot at St. Joseph's in South Troy. And every year in the fall, members of the youth ministry group at Our Lady of the Assumption, the parish up the street from us, those young people come and they plant daffodils. So as we move into the spring season, those daffodils bloom. They are signs of the wonderful new life that the sisters have now attained, and a reminder to all of us that their new life is the fullness of presence with the God whom they served so faithfully all the days of their lives.